The Thames is silver in the half-light of an October dawn, its surface broken only by the slow passage of barges carrying coal upriver. It is 1857, and a thin mist rises from the water, curling around the scaffolding that still clings to portions of the building that has dominated this stretch of riverbank for nearly 2 decades. The clock tower, not yet named for its famous bell, stands complete now against a sky the color of wet slate, its 4 faces dark, not yet illuminated by the gas lamps that will eventually make it visible across the city. In a few hours, the hammers will begin again, the chisels will bite into stone, and more than 2,000 men will resume their labor on what is already the most expensive public building ever constructed in Britain. But in this moment, there is only the mist, the river, and the impossible silhouette of Gothic ambition rising from the mud. A watchman pauses on Westminster Bridge, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He has walked this route for 3 years now, guarding the construction site through the night, and he's watched the building grow from foundations to towers, from skeletal iron frames to carved limestone facades. He does not know the names of the architects who designed it. He does not understand the parliamentary debates about its spiraling costs. What he knows is simpler and more profound, that men have died building this place, that the scaffolding claims lives each winter when frost makes the wooden platforms treacherous, that the stonecutters cough blood from years of breathing limestone dust, that somewhere beneath his feet, in tunnels dug through London clay, workers have collapsed from the fumes of the new heating system being installed. He looks up at the towers, at the carved saints and monarchs, at the heraldic beasts and intricate tracery that seem to float impossibly far above the water, and he feels something close to awe. But his awe is complicated by knowledge. He has carried broken bodies out of this site. He has seen widows collect their husbands' final wages at the contractor's office. He understands, in a way that most Londoners do not, that the beauty rising on this riverbank has been purchased with more than money. This is the Palace of Westminster. It is perhaps the most recognizable silhouette in the world, the mother of parliaments, the symbol of British democracy, the Gothic revival masterpiece that has defined London's skyline for over a century and a half. Its towers appear on banknotes and postcards, in films and photographs, as a kind of architectural shorthand for stability, tradition, and the endurance of institutions. When tourists gather on the opposite bank of the Thames, they point their cameras at the Elizabeth Tower and the Victoria Tower, at the delicate stonework, and the pinnacles that seem to multiply toward the heavens like prayers made solid. They see a building that appears eternal, inevitable, as if it had always stood here and always would. They see what they have been conditioned to see: power made beautiful, democracy given form in limestone and oak and gold leaf. What they do not see is the truth. They do not see the building slowly dissolving in London's acidic air, its soft stone eroding at rates that would horrify the men who chose it. They do not see the miles of pipes and ducts hidden within the walls, the Victorian heating system that required a man to shovel coal 16 hours a day, the electrical retrofitting that created fire risks that persist to this day. They do not see the army of craftspeople, stonemasons, gilders, woodworkers, conservation specialists who labor in shifts to slow the building's decay. They do not see the estimates running into the billions of pounds for a restoration project so vast that some argue it would be cheaper to demolish and rebuild. They do not see the human cost that has accumulated over nearly 2 centuries, the workers who died in construction, the administrators who exhausted themselves managing impossible budgets, the politicians who have debated for decades about how to save a building that was compromised from its first foundation stone. The Palace of Westminster is a magnificent fraud. Not in the sense that it fails to inspire, it does inspire profoundly and relentlessly, but in the sense that its beauty conceals an impossible burden, a weight of maintenance and repair and constant intervention that has never ceased since the first scaffolding came down. It is a building designed to project permanence while being, in fundamental ways, structurally and materially fragile. It is a building that was over budget before it was half finished and has remained over budget every year of its existence. It is a building that has required and continues to require sacrifice on a scale that most of us never consider when we admire its famous silhouette. To understand the Palace of Westminster, we must go back to a night of fire. October 16, 1834, a Thursday, the Old Palace of Westminster, a rambling collection of medieval buildings, Tudor additions, and Georgian modifications that had served as the seat of government for centuries, was destroyed in a blaze so spectacular that it drew crowds estimated at over 100,000 people. They lined the bridges and the riverbanks. They climbed onto rooftops and gathered in boats. Some cheered. The old palace had become a symbol of corruption and dysfunction, its cramped chambers home to a parliament that many viewed with contempt. The fire seemed almost divine in its judgment. A cleansing, a reset, a chance to begin again. The cause of the fire was almost absurdly mundane. Workmen had been tasked with disposing of a collection of wooden tally sticks, the notched pieces of wood that had been used for centuries to record financial transactions. Rather than remove them carefully, officials decided to burn them in the furnaces beneath the House of Lords. The furnaces, old and poorly maintained, could not handle the volume. They overheated. The heat traveled through the walls, igniting the paneling of the Lord's chamber. By the time the fire was discovered, it was already out of control. By morning, the old palace was gone, centuries of history reduced to smoking ruins along the Thames. Only one major structure survived, Westminster Hall, the medieval Great Hall built by William Rufus in 1097 and rebuilt by Richard II at the end of the 14th century. Its survival was a combination of luck, wind direction, and the heroic efforts of firefighters who understood that this ancient hammer beam roof, spanning nearly 70 feet without the support of columns, was irreplaceable. The hall stood intact amid the ruins, its gray stone blackened by smoke, its wooden roof scarred but unbroken. It became a kind of anchor, a piece of continuity around which the new palace would be designed. The decision to rebuild was never in doubt. But what to rebuild? This question consumed the British political establishment for years. A parliamentary committee was established. Architects were invited to submit designs. There was one critical constraint. The new palace must be built in either the Gothic or the Elizabethan style. This was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was an ideological statement. Gothic architecture was understood as the authentic English style, a return to medieval traditions that predated the classical influences that had dominated British building for a century. It was romantic, nationalistic, and deeply connected to ideas about continuity with a pre-industrial past. The new palace would not simply house Parliament, it would make an argument about English identity itself. 97 designs were submitted. The winner, announced in 1836, was Charles Barry. He was an unlikely choice for a Gothic building. Barry had made his reputation designing classical structures, Italianate clubs in London, Renaissance-style country houses for wealthy clients. He understood proportion, symmetry, and the formal language of classical architecture better than almost anyone working in England. Gothic design, with its asymmetry and organic complexity, was not his natural idiom. But Barry saw something in the Westminster competition that others missed. He understood that the real challenge was not ornament, but organization, not how the building would look, but how it would function. The site was irregular, constrained by the surviving Westminster Hall and the existing street patterns. The program was impossibly complex. 2 legislative chambers, libraries, committee rooms, offices for hundreds of members, ceremonial spaces for state occasions, and the need for separation between Commons and Lords. Barry approached the problem as an exercise in planning, creating a logical, symmetrical core that could accommodate all these demands while presenting a unified face to the river. For the Gothic details, the incrustation of ornament that would make the building unmistakably medieval in feeling, Barry turned to a collaborator, Augustus Welby. Northmore Pugin was everything Barry was not: young, passionate, erratic, and absolutely devoted to Gothic architecture as a moral cause. For Pugin, Gothic was not simply a style, it was a spiritual discipline, a return to the values of medieval Christianity, a rejection of the industrial modernity that he believed was corrupting English society. He designed with an intensity that bordered on mania, producing thousands of drawings for every element of the palace interior: the tiles, the wallpapers, the light fittings, the furniture, the metalwork, the carved woodwork, the stained glass. He worked 18-hour days. He burned through his health with a fervor that his contemporaries found alarming. And he understood, with a clarity that Barry sometimes lacked, that the success of the building would depend on the accumulation of detail, on the way that every surface would contribute to the overwhelming impression of medieval splendor. The relationship between Barry and Pugin was complicated from the start and grew more fraught as the building progressed. Barry was the official architect, Pugin was technically his assistant, but the degree of Pugin's contribution was far greater than this hierarchy suggested. He designed virtually every decorative element of the palace, a contribution so vast that it dominated the last decade of his life. He resented Barry's control over the project and the credit that flowed to the older man. Barry, for his part, defended his position as the master architect who had conceived the overall design, while quietly relying on Pugin's genius for the elements that would make it memorable. When Pugin died in 1852, aged only 40, exhausted by work and debilitated by what was probably syphilis, Barry delivered a memorial address that many felt understated his collaborators' contribution. The controversy over who truly designed the Palace of Westminster has never been fully resolved. What is not controversial is that the building required both of them: Barry's organizational brilliance and Pugin's obsessive decorative vision. Neither could have created it alone. Construction began in 1840. The first stone was laid without ceremony on a spring day that would be forgotten even as the building itself became unforgettable. From the beginning, the project was beset by challenges that tested the limits of Victorian engineering and Victorian patience. The site itself was problematic: low-lying ground adjacent to the Thames, prone to flooding and built over centuries of accumulated debris. A massive cofferdam was constructed to hold back the river while workers excavated and laid foundations. The ground was unstable. Additional pilings had to be driven deep into the London clay. The work was dangerous, and men died in the mud and the water before a single stone of the new palace was visible above ground. The choice of building stone became one of the project's most consequential decisions, and ultimately, one of its greatest mistakes. Barry and his committee selected limestone from quarries at Anston in Yorkshire and from Bolsover in Derbyshire. The stone was beautiful when freshly cut, honey-colored, fine-grained, easy to carve into the intricate details that Pugin's designs demanded, but it had a fatal flaw. Anston limestone was a magnesian limestone, and it was porous in ways that made it vulnerable to London's atmosphere. The city's air was saturated with sulfur from the burning of coal, millions of tons of coal consumed each year in homes and factories and on the railways that converged on the capital. The sulfur combined with moisture to form sulfuric acid. The acid attacked the stone. Within decades of the palace's completion, the facade was already deteriorating. The intricate carvings were softening, losing definition, dissolving into formless masses. A building designed to endure for centuries was being eaten alive by the air that surrounded it. But this was a problem for the future. In the 1840s, as the walls rose and the scaffolding climbed ever higher, the concerns were more immediate. The workforce was enormous, over 2,000 men at the peak of construction, and managing them required a bureaucratic apparatus that was itself unprecedented. Stonemasons came from across Britain, along with specialized carvers recruited from abroad. Carpenters worked on the timber frames that would support the roofs. Ironworkers fabricated the structural elements that gave the building its hidden strength. The cast iron beams that spanned the great chambers, the iron roof trusses concealed behind the Gothic profiles of stone. Laborers did the brutal work of moving materials, the tons of stone arriving by barge on the Thames, the mountains of timber and slate and lead that had to be hoisted and positioned. The noise was constant, the dust overwhelming, the danger ever present. Men fell from scaffolding. They were crushed by falling stone. They developed respiratory diseases from years of working in clouds of limestone particles. Their names are not recorded on any memorial. They remain anonymous, their contribution measured only in the building that outlived them. The iron skeleton of the palace represents one of the great hidden innovations of Victorian architecture. Though the building presents itself as stone, it is in many ways a structure of iron and timber, with the stone functioning as cladding and ornament rather than primary support. This was necessary for practical reasons. The spans required for the legislative chambers were too great for traditional stone construction. But it also created problems that persist to this day. Iron expands and contracts with temperature changes, moving differently than the stone that surrounds it. Over time, this differential movement has cracked masonry and opened joints. Water has infiltrated, causing rust, which expands and damages the stone further. The building has been engaged in a slow process of self-destruction since the day it was completed. The interior spaces of the Palace of Westminster were designed to overwhelm. This was not incidental. It was the explicit intention of the architects and their patrons. The Houses of Parliament were meant to project British power at the height of empire, to impress foreign visitors and humble domestic critics. The scale is difficult to comprehend without walking through it. Over 1,000 rooms, more than 100 staircases, nearly 3 miles of corridors. The central lobby, where the two houses meet, rises 65 feet to a vaulted ceiling encrusted with Venetian mosaic. The House of Lords is upholstered in scarlet, dominated by the gilded canopy of the throne where the monarch sits to open Parliament. The House of Commons, smaller and more intimate, was designed to feel like a chapel with opposing benches arranged like choir stalls. Every surface, walls, ceilings, floors, door frames, received Pugin's attention. The brass hinges were specially designed. The inkwells were Gothic. The umbrella stands were medieval in spirit, if not in function. The encaustic tiles, manufactured by Minton to Pugin's patterns, depicted heraldic devices and traditional motifs in colors that had not been seen in English buildings for centuries. The effect, for those who experienced it when new, must have been staggering. Here was a building that seemed to have emerged fully formed from the medieval past, complete in every detail, as if the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution had never happened. Of course, this was an illusion. The building was thoroughly modern in its construction methods and its services, even as it presented itself as ancient. It had gas lighting from the beginning, with thousands of jets that required a small army of workers to light each evening. It had a heating and ventilation system so ambitious that it occupied nearly as much of the original architect's attention as the visible building above ground. This mechanical system deserves particular attention because it reveals the hidden complexity that has always lain beneath Westminster's Gothic facades. The designer was David Boswell Reid, a Scottish physician and chemist who believed that air quality was essential to human health and intellectual performance. Reid proposed a system that would draw fresh air from towers, filter it through layers of cotton wool and charcoal, heat it during winter, cool it during summer, and distribute it through the chambers via a network of underground passages and floor-level vents. The air would then be extracted through the ceiling and expelled through a massive central tower, what would become the central tower that rises over the building's heart. The system was revolutionary. It was also impossibly complex, expensive, and contentious. Reid and Barry clashed repeatedly over its implementation. Each accused the other of incompetence and obstruction. The system, when finally installed, never worked as intended. The chambers were alternately too hot and too cold, too stuffy and too drafty. Members complained bitterly. Reid was eventually dismissed and much of his system was abandoned or replaced, but its infrastructure remains embedded in the building, miles of ducts and passages that are now obsolete but impossible to remove, creating maintenance nightmares for subsequent generations. The clock tower, known today as the Elizabeth Tower, was completed in 1859, and its great bell, later nicknamed Big Ben, rang out over London for the first time on May 31st of that year. The tower stands 316 feet tall, its 4 clock faces each measuring over 22 feet in diameter, its mechanism so precise that it can be adjusted by placing old pennies on the pendulum. The bell weighs over 13 tons. When it cracked 2 months after its installation, it was turned slightly and struck with a lighter hammer, producing the distinctive tone that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in the world. The tower was designed to be seen from anywhere in Westminster, a symbol of parliamentary authority reaching above the city. But it also served a practical function. Its clock was intended to provide the official time for the entire nation, a statement of centralized control in an age when local variations in timekeeping were being eliminated by the railways. Charles Barry died in 1860, 11 years before the palace was officially completed. He devoted nearly a quarter-century of his life to the project, managing impossible budgets and intractable contractors, defending his design against constant criticism, and watching his health deteriorate under the pressure. He did not live to see the final carved pinnacle placed or the last interior decoration completed. His son, Edward, took over the work and saw it through to nominal completion in 1870, though, in truth, the building has never been truly finished. There's never been a moment when all of its surfaces were complete, all of its systems functional, all of its stones in good repair. Completion was always a legal fiction, a declaration made for bureaucratic convenience rather than architectural reality. The costs of building the Palace of Westminster, exceeded every estimate, broke every budget, and generated political controversy that lasted for decades. The original estimate in 1836 was approximately £700,000, a vast sum, but one that seemed proportionate to the importance of the building. By the time of nominal completion, the actual expenditure had exceeded £2 million, with some calculations running as high as £3 million when interest on borrowed funds was included. In modern terms, adjusted for inflation and economic scale, this might be equivalent to several £billion, a figure that made Westminster one of the most expensive public buildings in history. Parliamentary committees investigated the overruns, apportioned blame, and demanded explanations. Barry defended himself with the argument that the scope of the project had expanded far beyond the original brief, that the demands of patrons and committees had grown with each passing year, that the mechanical systems alone had added costs that could not have been anticipated. He was right about all of this. He was also guilty, as architects often are, of initial optimism that shaded into something close to deception. The true cost of the building was known at some level long before it was acknowledged. Who paid this cost? The formal answer is simple: the British taxpayer. But this abstraction conceals more than it reveals. In the mid-19th century, the tax base of Britain was narrow and regressive. Income tax had been introduced to fund the Napoleonic Wars, abolished, reintroduced, and was still fiercely debated. Customs and excise duties, taxes on goods consumed by ordinary people, provided a substantial portion of government revenue. The working classes of Britain, who would never enter the Palace of Westminster, except as petitioners or servants, contributed through the prices they paid for everyday necessities. The colonies of the expanding empire contributed through the extraction of resources and labor that generated the wealth taxed in London. The cost of the palace was distributed across a population that had no voice in its design and little prospect of ever using its facilities. This is not unique to Westminster. It is the nature of monumental architecture in hierarchical societies. But it is worth remembering, when we admire the gilded ceilings and intricate carvings, that they were funded by people who could not read the inscriptions or recognize the heraldic devices or understand the constitutional principles that the building was meant to embody. The more immediate cost was borne by the men who built it. Construction workers in Victorian England had few protections and limited recourse when injured. They were paid by the day or by the piece. If they could not work, they did not eat. The safety standards of the building site would be considered criminal by modern standards. Scaffolding was often inadequate. Lifting equipment was primitive. The long hours and dangerous conditions produced injuries that disabled men for life and deaths that left families destitute. There are no reliable figures for the total casualties of Westminster's construction. Records were not kept or have not survived or were never considered important enough to maintain. What we know comes from fragmentary sources, newspaper reports of fatal accidents, contractors' records that mention payments to widows, occasional references in parliamentary testimony. We know that men died. We do not know how many. Within years of the palace's completion, the deterioration of its stone was already visible. Parliamentary committees were convened to investigate. Experts were consulted. The Anston limestone, which had seemed so promising, was revealed to be a catastrophe in slow motion. The surface of the stone was case-hardening, forming a thin, glassy crust that trapped moisture beneath and accelerated decay. When the crust finally failed, the underlying stone crumbled. Carved details that had taken craftsmen weeks to complete dissolved into shapeless masses within decades. The statues of monarchs and saints that lined the building's facades became unrecognizable. The intricate tracery of the windows began to fail. The response, initially, was piecemeal. Damaged stones were replaced individually, using methods that varied depending on the contractor and the budget available. Some sections were recarved, others were patched with morite, an early form of stone repair compound. By the early 20th century, the scale of the problem was undeniable. The building was being attacked from without by pollution and from within by its own structural dynamics. The iron that had been embedded in the masonry was rusting and expanding, cracking the stone. Water infiltration was causing internal damage that was invisible until suddenly catastrophic. The original heating system, never satisfactory, had been supplemented and modified until it was a maze of redundant pipes and obsolete equipment. The electrical retrofitting, begun in the 1880s and expanded repeatedly thereafter, had created fire risks that were barely managed. The building was aging far faster than anyone had anticipated. And then came the war. The night of May 10th, 1941, was the last and worst night of the London Blitz. German bombers attacked the city in waves, dropping incendiary devices and high explosives across a wide area. The Palace of Westminster was hit multiple times. The House of Commons chamber, Pugin's intimate Gothic chapel of democracy, was destroyed. Its roof collapsed, its carved woodwork burned, its stained glass melted into pools of color on the stone floor. Westminster Hall, which had survived the fire of 1834, was struck by incendiaries, but saved by firefighters who remembered the lessons of that earlier catastrophe. The House of Lords sustained damage but remained intact. The Elizabeth Tower, struck by debris, remained standing, its clock continuing to mark the hours through the destruction. The destruction of the Commons chamber presented both a crisis and an opportunity. Britain was at war, resources were scarce, labor was directed toward military production. There was no possibility of rebuilding immediately. For years, the Commons met in the Lords' chamber, while the Lords used the Queen's robbing room. The temporary arrangements became semi-permanent, a reminder of the building's fragility. When reconstruction finally began after the war, it was led by Giles Gilbert Scott, the architect responsible for Liverpool Cathedral and the iconic red telephone box. Scott chose to rebuild the Commons chamber in a style that deliberately recalled Pugin's original, while incorporating modern materials and fire protection. The new chamber was smaller, less ornate, and built to standards that the original could never have met. It was completed in 1950, nearly a century after the rest of the palace. In some ways, it was a different building, modern concrete and steel behind a Gothic facade, practical rather than romantic, engineered rather than crafted. In other ways, it was the final expression of the ideal that had animated the original project, the belief that British democracy required a setting that combined tradition with renewal, continuity with adaptation. The post-war decades brought new challenges. The pollution that had been eating the stone for a century intensified as London's population grew and its industries expanded. The Clean Air Act of 1956 began to address the problem, but the damage already done was irreversible. Stone conservation became a permanent occupation at Westminster. A specialized workshop was established, training masons in techniques that combined traditional carving with modern preservation science. Each year, deteriorated sections were surveyed, prioritized, and scheduled for replacement. The work was slow, expensive, and essentially endless. The building was not being restored to an original condition. It was being continuously remade, stone by stone, in an ongoing process of renewal that had no foreseeable end. The hidden systems of the palace proved even more difficult to manage. The heating, ventilation, and plumbing had been modified so many times that no single plan showed the complete picture. Miles of abandoned pipe and duct remained in place, impossible to remove without demolishing the walls that concealed them. The electrical system had evolved from gas to early direct current to alternating current, with each generation of wiring layered over the last. Fire safety reviews consistently identified risks that could not be eliminated without fundamental reconstruction. The building had become a kind of archaeological site, with layers of infrastructure representing different eras of technology and different standards of safety. Navigating this complexity required institutional knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation of maintenance staff, much of it never fully documented, some of it lost forever when experienced workers retired or died. The question of public access became increasingly important in the late 20th century. The Palace of Westminster was, in theory, a public building, owned by the nation and serving the nation's representatives. In practice, it was extraordinarily difficult for ordinary citizens to enter. Security concerns, amplified by decades of IRA attacks and later by the threat of international terrorism, had transformed the building into a fortress. Visitors were screened, searched, and channeled through limited routes. The vast majority of the palace's 1,000 rooms remained inaccessible to anyone without parliamentary business. This created a paradox. The building was both the symbol of British democracy and one of the least democratic spaces in the nation, a place of privilege and restriction where the public entered, if at all, as guests in their own house. The economics of maintaining the palace became increasingly unsustainable as the 20th century gave way to the 21st. The annual cost of basic maintenance ran to tens of millions of pounds. Major conservation projects, replacing sections of stonework, upgrading mechanical systems, addressing structural defects, added hundreds of millions more. Parliamentary committees issued reports, commissioned studies, and debated options that ranged from incremental repair to complete decampment and reconstruction. The numbers were staggering. A full restoration of the palace, addressing all of its accumulated problems, was estimated to cost between 4 and 6 billion pounds, and some suggested even these figures were optimistic. The timeline would stretch over decades. The disruption would require moving Parliament to temporary facilities for years at a time. The political will to commit to such a project wavered with each change of government and each shift in public priorities. The palace exists today in a state of managed decay. This is not a metaphor. The building is literally falling apart, and the task of its custodians is to slow this process, to prioritize the most urgent repairs, to keep the structure functional while larger questions about its future remain unresolved. Water leaks through the roofs, stonework crumbles from the facades, mechanical systems fail and are patched rather than replaced. The workforce required to maintain this equilibrium is substantial. Hundreds of conservators, craftspeople, engineers, cleaners, and administrators, their labor invisible to the politicians who pass through the corridors and the tourists who photograph the towers. They are the latest in a continuous line of workers whose efforts have kept the building standing, the successors of the men who died in its construction, and the generations who have maintained it since. The argument for preservation is not primarily aesthetic, though the aesthetic value of the palace is undeniable. It is historical and symbolic. This is where the British Constitution has been debated and modified for nearly 2 centuries, where wars have been declared and social reforms enacted, where the relationship between Parliament and people has been negotiated through crises that threaten to tear the nation apart. The building embodies that history in its very fabric: the medieval hall where kings dispensed justice, the Victorian chambers where the modern state was created, the reconstructed commons where post-war Britain found its voice. To lose the building would be to lose a physical connection to that past, a tangible reminder of the struggles and compromises that created the present. And yet preservation comes at a cost that extends beyond money. The effort required to maintain Westminster diverts resources from other needs. The political attention consumed by debates about its future distracts from other priorities. The building itself, designed for a 19th century parliament, fits poorly with the demands of 21st century governance. Its chambers are too small for modern parliaments, its offices are cramped and outdated, its systems cannot accommodate the technology that contemporary government requires. Adapting it to these needs would require interventions that some consider inappropriate to its heritage status. Refusing to adapt condemns its occupants to conditions that impair their ability to function. The people who work at Westminster today, not the politicians, but the staff who keep the building operating, inhabit a world that most visitors never glimpse. There are tunnels beneath the building that stretch for hundreds of meters, connecting different sections of the complex and providing routes for service personnel, equipment, and utilities. There are workshops where stonemasons carve replacement pieces for decayed elements of the facade, working with techniques that would have been recognizable to their Victorian predecessors. There are conservation studios where specialists analyze the composition of historic wallpapers and develop methods to stabilize deteriorating textiles. There are engineering offices where technicians monitor the building systems, tracking temperature and humidity, managing fire suppression, coordinating the endless cycle of maintenance and repair. These spaces are functional, utilitarian, sometimes cramped and uncomfortable. They are the hidden infrastructure that makes the visible grandeur possible. The contrast between the public and private faces of Westminster is stark. Visitors who enter through the great stone portals, who walk across the encaustic tiles and gaze up at the vaulted ceilings, experience the building as its architects intended, as an overwhelming display of Gothic splendor, a testament to the power and permanence of British institutions. But step through a staff door, descend a service stair, enter the basement corridors where pipes run overhead and the walls are bare brick, and the illusion dissolves. Here is the truth of the building, that its beauty is a performance, maintained by constant effort, supported by infrastructure that no visitor sees, sustained by labor that no guidebook acknowledges. The palace is not a monument, it is a machine. And like all machines, it requires fuel, maintenance, and the continuous attention of those who understand its workings. The question of who truly paid for Westminster cannot be answered with a single figure or a single constituency. The taxpayers of Victorian Britain paid through taxes that fell most heavily on those who could least afford them. The workers who built it paid with their health and sometimes their lives in conditions that offered little protection and no recognition. The generations who have maintained it have paid, with careers devoted to the endless task of keeping the building standing. The politicians and citizens who might have directed those resources elsewhere have paid in opportunities foregone and priorities deferred. The building itself has paid in the slow dissolution of its fabric, the loss of Pugin's original details, the accumulated compromises of 2 centuries of repair and modification. The cost of Westminster is distributed across time and space, visible only in fragments, never fully accounted for in any single budget or memorial. And the cost continues. Every year, millions of pounds flow into the maintenance of the palace. Every year, stones are replaced and systems upgraded and leaks repaired. Every year, the gap between what is needed and what is provided grows wider, and the backlog of deferred maintenance grows longer. The restoration and renewal program, launched with ambitions of comprehensive renovation, has been delayed, rescoped, and debated to the point where its eventual form remains uncertain. Meanwhile, the building deteriorates, the fire risk remains high. The mechanical systems continue to age past their design life. The stone continues to dissolve in the London air, cleaner now than a century ago, but still corrosive, still relentless in its assault on the limestone facades. There is a philosophical dimension to this persistence of cost. The palace was built to project permanence, to create the impression that British institutions were eternal and unchanging. Its Gothic style was chosen specifically because it evoked a distant past, a continuity with medieval traditions that the Victorians wished to claim as their own. But permanence is always an illusion, in architecture as in politics. Buildings do not endure through their own inherent stability. They endure because people choose to maintain them, generation after generation, at costs that must be justified anew each time. Westminster survives not because it is permanent, but because British society has repeatedly decided that it is worth preserving, and has been willing to pay in money and labor and attention the price that preservation demands. This is the hidden truth of all great buildings, but it is particularly true of Westminster, because Westminster was always, in some sense, a deception. It presented itself as ancient while being thoroughly modern. It concealed its iron skeleton behind stone facades and its mechanical systems behind carved paneling. It was designed to overwhelm, to create the impression of effortless grandeur, to make visitors feel that they were in the presence of something that had always existed and always would. The cost of this deception has been ongoing. The need to maintain the illusion, to replace the decaying surfaces while preserving the appearance of antiquity, to hide the labor that keeps the building functioning while presenting it as an unchanging monument. Consider the stonemasons who work in the conservation workshop a few hundred meters from the main building, in a space filled with limestone dust and the sound of chisels on stone. They are carrying on a tradition that extends back to the original construction, but they are not recreating the past. They are preserving a fiction, the fiction that the stone facades of Westminster are the same stones that were installed in the 1840s and 1850s. In fact, vast sections of the exterior have been replaced, sometimes multiple times. The building that visitors see today is not the building that Barry and Pugin created. It is a continuously renewed approximation, a ship of Theseus rebuilt stone by stone while maintaining the form of the original. The masons who do this work are skilled in techniques that have been handed down through generations, but they are also trained in modern conservation science, in the analysis of stone composition and the application of consolidants and the documentation of deterioration patterns. Their labor is a fusion of tradition and innovation, of craftsmanship and technology, much like the building they are preserving. The heating and cooling of the palace remains a challenge that has never been fully solved. The original system designed by David Boswell Reed, with its ambitious attempt to control indoor climate through mechanical means, was abandoned in frustration within years of its installation. Subsequent systems have been layered over its remains, steam heating, then hot water, then a patchwork of different approaches in different sections of the building. Today, The palace is heated and cooled by a combination of methods that no single plan can fully document. There are areas where Victorian radiators still function, others where modern climate control has been retrofitted at great expense. The basement corridors contain pipes and ducts that were installed a century and a half ago alongside equipment that was added last year. The energy consumption is enormous, millions of pounds annually for heating, cooling, and lighting a building whose design predates modern insulation and energy efficiency standards. Reducing this consumption would require interventions that might damage historic fabric. Maintaining it requires expenditures that grow each year as energy costs rise and equipment ages. The fire risk at Westminster has been a concern since the building's completion, and it has only grown more acute as systems have aged and vulnerabilities have accumulated. The ironwork of the roof structure, designed to be fireproof, has become a liability as connections have loosened and fire barriers have degraded. The electrical wiring, installed in multiple phases over more than a century, includes sections that are decades past their safe operating life. The building's layout, with its miles of corridors and its interconnected spaces, would make a major fire extremely difficult to contain and could easily produce the kind of catastrophe that destroyed the old palace in 1834. There have been near misses, small fires that were caught and extinguished before they spread, incidents that revealed vulnerabilities and prompted emergency repairs. The palace exists in a state of managed risk, its occupants trusting that the systems and personnel in place will prevent disaster, while knowing that the probability of a major fire remains higher than anyone would like to admit. At the heart of the building, Westminster Hall continues to stand as it has for over 600 years. Its hammer-beam roof, spanning nearly 70 feet without columns, is an engineering marvel that was already ancient when the Victorian palace rose around it. The hall has witnessed coronation banquets and state trials, the lying in state of monarchs and the celebrations of national triumphs. It is the one space in the complex that genuinely connects the present to the medieval past, that was here before the Tudors and the Stuarts and the Georgians and the Victorians, that survived the fire of 1834 and the Blitz of 1941, that remains as a reminder of what endurance actually looks like. But even Westminster Hall requires constant care. Its roof has been repaired multiple times, its stonework has been consolidated, its floor has been relaid. It is not unchanged. It has been continuously maintained by generations of workers whose names are not recorded, whose labor is visible only in the survival of the structure itself. The present day finds the Palace of Westminster at a crossroads. The scale of the work required to address its accumulated problems is so vast that incremental approaches are no longer viable. Yet the political and financial commitment required for a comprehensive restoration remains elusive. Parliament continues to meet in chambers that are deteriorating around it, served by systems that are obsolete and sometimes dangerous, housed in a building that was designed for a different era and a different kind of governance. The symbolism of this situation is not lost on observers. The mother of parliaments, struggling to maintain its own house, unable to agree on the investments required to secure its future. The debate over Westminster's restoration has become, in some ways, a proxy for larger debates about British priorities and British identity, about what the nation values and what it is willing to pay for. There is no resolution in sight. The choices facing Westminster are choices without good options. Spend billions to restore a building that may never fully meet modern needs, or accept a gradual decline that risks catastrophic failure, or abandon the site entirely and construct something new. Each option has advocates. None has commanded a consensus. The palace persists in its present state, neither restored nor abandoned, maintained at minimum levels while fundamental decisions are deferred. The workers who keep it functioning do their best with the resources they have. The stones continue to decay. The systems continue to age. The cost continues to accumulate. What does the Palace of Westminster teach us about the price of beauty? Perhaps this, that great buildings do not maintain themselves, that the grandeur we admire is always the product of labor, much of it invisible, much of it unacknowledged, that the construction of a monument is only the beginning of its cost. The real expense lies in the centuries of care that follow, that every generation that chooses to preserve the past does so at the expense of other priorities, diverting resources from the present to maintain a connection with what came before. That this is neither good nor bad in itself, but is a choice that should be made consciously, with full awareness of what is being sacrificed. The Palace of Westminster is beautiful. Its towers against the London sky, its reflection in the Thames at dusk, its intricate carvings and gilded interiors, its famous clock face and its unmistakable silhouette. These are genuinely beautiful things, worthy of admiration and worth preserving. But beauty is not enough. Beauty does not prevent decay. Beauty does not pay for repairs. Beauty does not ensure survival. What ensures survival is work, the unglamorous, repetitive, often uncomfortable work of maintenance and conservation, of inspection and repair, of planning and budgeting and allocating resources. The palace survives because people have done this work year after year, generation after generation, and because other people have been willing to fund it, even when the expenditure seemed excessive, even when the resources might have been spent elsewhere. This is the lesson of Westminster, and it extends far beyond architecture. The institutions we inherit do not maintain themselves. The freedoms we enjoy are not guaranteed by their own inherent virtue. Everything that endures does so because people choose to preserve it, at costs that are rarely visible and never fully appreciated. The Palace of Westminster, with its Gothic spires and its hidden machinery, its golden throne and its deteriorating stonework, its symbolic grandeur and its practical fragility, stands as a monument to this truth. It is beautiful because it was designed to be beautiful. It survives because generations have worked to preserve it. It will continue only if future generations make the same choice. The mist has burned off the Thames now, and the autumn sun strikes the limestone facades of Westminster, turning them to gold. From the south bank, tourists raise their phones and capture the image that will represent their visit, the towers, the pinnacles, the clock face reading an hour that will never be forgotten. They do not see the scaffolding on the northern facade, where masons are replacing another section of decayed stone. They do not see the engineers in the basement monitoring the building systems on screens that display temperatures and pressures and flow rates. They do not see the conservators in their workshop carving replacement pieces for elements that Pugin designed 170 years ago. They see only the beauty. But now, perhaps you can see more. You can see the labor behind the facade, the cost concealed within the grandeur, the endless effort that makes endurance possible. You can understand that this building, like all buildings, is not a static monument but a process, a continuous negotiation between decay and renewal, between what we inherit and what we choose to maintain. You can appreciate that the Palace of Westminster survives not because it was built to last, it was not, but because each generation has decided, after weighing the costs and the alternatives, that it was worth the effort. The clock strikes the hour. Big Ben's note rolls out across the city, as it has for more than 160 years. Somewhere in the building, a stonecutter's chisel bites into limestone. Somewhere else, a heating engineer adjusts a valve in a pipe that was installed before either of them was born. The palace endures. The work continues. The cost goes on. When we admire the monuments of our shared past, do we ever truly consider the invisible labor and ongoing sacrifice that allows them to stand before us? And are we prepared to decide what we are willing to pay to pass them on?